Hi everyone. So as you may know if you've seen some of my other videos, I haven't uploaded to this channel in a long time. And the main reason for that is because something changed in my life about a year ago that made it harder for me to film. But recently something changed again, and so I have more ability to film, hopefully more often. And I saw this video this past week that I really wanted to talk about. So I'm going to. Now this video is from someone named David Alexander, and the title of this video is www.answeringldscritics.com. Mormon Stories is a destroy childlike faith internet financial complex. And it's basically not just about Mormon stories, but about critics of the LDS faith in general, particularly ex-Mormon critics, I believe, and how current members of the LDS Church should view those critics. And as you can imagine, with me being a person who is critical of the LDS Church and a former member of the LDS Church, I had some things to say about what this video suggested current members do about these critics. So after introducing himself, the narrator of the video gets into the problem he wants to address, which is that many members of the LDS Church are having faith crises due to hearing negative information about the LDS Church. And he says something right off the bat that I think is very interesting. I'm going to play it for you now.
Even if they heard information from a friend or a family member, the original source of the information at some point was likely a critic.
So right away, what he's trying to get the members of his audience to think is that when there is negative information or information that's perceived as negative about the LDS Church, it usually originates from someone who is against the LDS Church. And this would make sense if you think about it, because people who support the LDS Church generally aren't going to want to share negative information about it. But I think that it overlooks something about the way a lot of this negative information works, which is that people who are finding out more about church history, especially if they are still believing members as they're finding out more about church history, are much more ready to believe a source that comes from somebody who believed in the LDS Church at the time they wrote it. So, for example, someone talking about polygamy who was one of Joseph Smith's plural wives, but was still in the LDS Church at the time when she was talking about the polygamy, would hold more weight than somebody who had left the church and then claimed that Joseph Smith propositioned her to be a plural wife. And what is really interesting, and what I think causes a lot of people to have problems with church history, is when they realize that there are a lot of sources that at the time were supportive of the church who now are no longer referenced by the church very much, especially in the current manuals, because if they were referenced, you would see that their accounts either didn't line up with the narrative the church is trying to portray today, or they are saying things that modern society would find either offensive or very questionable or very unlikely to be true. And the church doesn't want to put that forward as something that was said in the past by believers or even by prophets. And because of that, I think that we're at a point where, yes, most information about the LDS Church that could be considered negative will at some point have gone through a critic before it gets to a believing person. But that doesn't mean it originated with a critic. Like I said, I think the information that believers of the LDS Church would find most problematic are not the things that detractors of the church said, but things that Joseph Smith said, things that Brigham Young said, things that Joseph Smith's plural wives said, or things that members of the church who believed at the time said that Joseph Smith or Brigham Young said, that now do not line up with what the LDS Church would want you to believe it believes today. So moving on, here is the next clip that I wanted to discuss, and it's about how this person views LDS critics in general.
Now, at the onset, I want to be clear that critics need our love and our prayers. While I am pretty direct about their methods and their organizations, I never target an individual by name. My goal isn't to slander our critics personally. That's not what our Savior would do. But I think he would condemn actions, and members of the church need to understand the critics' strategies and motivation, because in doing so, we're going to be less likely to take their information at face value.
So first of all, I just want to say I think it's good that he starts off with saying that people really shouldn't hate critics of the LDS Church. But I find it interesting that he also implies here, although he doesn't quite say it yet, that these critics are being dishonest. And we'll get into some more direct insinuations of dishonesty as we continue to view this video.
LDS critics start by publishing massive volumes of negative and many times untrue videos and podcasts about the church, its leaders, or its history that cause trusting members to feel betrayed by the church and that everything they have been taught was a lie. They are understandably confused, angry, and overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information. Then, in an act of self-appointed heroism, the critic runs to their rescue with compassionate offers of help by pushing even more videos, which is more money, offering conferences and seminars, which makes them more money, and providing one-on-one coaching, again, more money. All the while, they're soliciting their new recruits for donations, again, more money, and selling ex-Mormon products, more money. They convince their victims they are better off without the oppression of Mormonism, leaving the member with gut-wrenching lost faith and strained family relationships. The member steps away from the church and shares the misinformation with others, which starts the self-perpetuating cycle all over again. Now, this is a bold statement about our critics, but this video will show conclusive evidence that critics are indeed helping to facilitate a faith crisis in members and then profiting from the help that they offer.
So I find that part of the video really interesting because you'll notice that he says that he'll provide conclusive evidence that the critics are helping to facilitate faith crises and then receiving money from the help that they offer in dealing with those faith crises. But what he doesn't say is that any of those faith crises, what he doesn't say that he'll show rather, is that those faith crises are caused by untrue information. He says that the information that critics are providing is many times untrue, but there is no claim that he'll show any evidence of that, and in fact, there is no evidence of that throughout this video. There is, as far as I can remember, no talk about any specific claims that critics make. It's all about the fact that critics are making money as a result of the things that they do. So, not surprisingly, the first organization that this video talks about is Mormon Stories. And it starts off by mentioning that because Mormon Stories is a nonprofit, it is required to disclose its financial information by the U.S. government, which means that certain forms are available for a string of years ending in 2001. And so this video starts by looking at Mormon Stories' financial information from the 2001 form that they filed.
This here is the 990 for 2021. The IRS has not published 990 information for 2022 or 2023 yet, so this is the most recent form available. Notice, though, that their revenue, even from 2 years ago, was $750,868, almost $750,000. One important way that they make money is through donations. So they very actively solicit donations both on their YouTube channels and their website. As you can see on their website homepage, there are at least 4 different places to donate just on this one page alone.
So, to start off with, I just find it very interesting that he is referring to the number that's about $750,000 as if that's a big number, when the number that comes to mind in my mind when I see that is the $120 billion that I've heard that the LDS Church has. And unlike Mormon Stories, which has to be transparent about its finances, the LDS Church does not, because it's a church. Which means we don't actually know all the things that the LDS Church is using its money for. And we wouldn't even know it had that much money if it weren't for leaks. And as for asking for donations, yes, John DeLynn, the founder of Mormon Stories, asks for donations a lot. And watching the ends of his videos can be kind of annoying because of how much he asks for donations. However, what John DeLynn does not do is threaten that you might be burned at the second coming or be locked out of the top part of heaven forever if you don't give him donation money. So the real question here, because I don't want to just engage in whataboutism and say, oh, well, what the LDS Church is doing is worse, therefore don't pay attention to what John DeLynn's doing at all. The real question here is, who is telling the truth? Is it the LDS Church, or is it John DeLynn or other ex-Mormon critics? Because if the LDS Church is telling the truth, you're right, it doesn't matter how much money the LDS Church is asking. It's the only way to receive the ordinances necessary for salvation. But if the LDS Church is not telling the truth, and maybe John DeLynn isn't telling all the truth either, but maybe he's telling some of the truth, then wouldn't it be a good thing to know that? And how can you say, if the LDS Church isn't telling the truth, that John DeLynn is any worse than the LDS Church? Because I certainly don't think he is.
So, is it working to publish this much negative information about the church? Is it impacting the minds of members? Is it destroying faith? Well, based on the revenue gains for Mormon Stories over the last 8 years, it is definitely working. This is a summary of contributions for Mormon Stories from 2013 to 2021. All of this data comes from the critics themselves as reported to the IRS. Now, this is public information, so if you doubt these numbers, I invite you to look them up yourself online to verify. It's easy to find. As you can see, the average percent increase in their contributions for the 8 years from 2013 to 2021 was 26%. Although the IRS has not yet released data for 2022 or 2023, we can easily estimate their contributions by applying the average growth rate of 26%. You can see here they are on track to make nearly $1.2 million in 2023.
So I have 2 comments on that section of video. The first is, this person asks, is what Mormon Stories is doing working? And then goes on to describe revenue, which is a subtle way to imply that what Mormon Stories really cares about is money. And that may or may not be true, and we'll get into that later as we go on with this video. But I just find that tactic interesting because it's almost as if this person is saying that Mormon Stories doesn't really care about its message or whether this message is good or bad. The second thing that I want to point out is that averaging the growth rate may not be the best way to determine how much money Mormon Stories is likely to have made last year and likely to make this year, because if you look at the yearly growth rates, the last yearly growth rate that we have access to is 47%, not 26%. And so if the heightened growth rate holds or even holds partially, Mormon Stories is actually doing way better financially than this person may realize.
Okay, so Mormon Stories is making a lot of money in contributions, but they are a nonprofit, so they're just using that money to help people in a faith crisis, right? Well, not so much. While the nonprofit label implies that no one is personally profiting from proceeds or donations, the reality is the board of directors of any nonprofit entity may grant the CEO a raise of any amount if they so choose. In 2021, the CEO of Mormon Stories' salary was $230,000 a year with an additional $33,115 in compensation. Based on his average increase rates, by 2023, this CEO's salary will have more than tripled since 2013. And keep in mind, his salary is largely funded by donations from people who are experiencing or who have experienced emotional trauma.
So this is something that I don't want to comment on too much necessarily, because I'm not going to say whether what John Dehlin is having Mormon Stories pay him is a reasonable amount or not. However, I do want to reiterate that unlike the LDS Church, John Dehlin is not claiming that people will suffer eternal consequences if they don't donate to him. And he is being public about how much money he is making. Because, you see, the leaders of the LDS Church also make money. From what I understand, they also make about $200,000 per year. And that is what is referred to by the church as a modest stipend. And you can decide whether it's modest or not. The point is, what John Dehlin made in 2001 is not that far off from what I've heard that the top leaders of the LDS Church are given every year. And so, like I said, the real question here is not about money, it's about who's telling the truth. Because I don't think most members, even if they heard that the top leaders of the LDS Church were making the amount of money that they're making per year, would automatically feel super bad about it. Because after all, if they're doing the Lord's work and they need to be sustained while doing the Lord's work, there's a way to find a way to support that as a member of the church. What I'm saying, though, is who's telling the truth. That's what's really important. Not who's making the most money, because guess what? It's the LDS Church overall that's making the most money out of this.
Now, it's a numbers game. The more people with a faith crisis, the more people that will watch their videos, the more people will attend their conferences, the more people will want their counseling services, and the more people will donate to their foundation. For Mormon critics and Mormon stories specifically, the more faith they shake, the more money they make. So every honest Latter-day Saint should ask themselves this question: are LDS critics financially motivated to see me go through a faith crisis? The answer is a resounding yes.
So at this point, I want to talk about the logistics of making content on YouTube, or really anywhere else. In order to justify the time that it takes to make content, at some point, most creators are going to want to be making some money in exchange for that content in some way. At this point, so far, I'm not popular enough where it makes sense for me to go around asking people for money in order to make content. That just doesn't make sense for me. And I may never be popular enough that that will make sense. But I can't say that it hasn't crossed my mind that if I did become popular enough, I would do that. Does that mean I don't care about what I'm saying? No. Does it mean that I'm financially motivated in order to see people go through a faith crisis? Maybe in a theoretical sense, I could be called that, because theoretically, someday, some way, maybe I could make some money off of what I'm doing. But that is so far away from where I am right now that it seems pretty silly to think of it that way. The videos I put out because I care about what I have to say. And I think that that's how the majority of people who put videos out online about Mormonism are thinking about it, whether they agree with Mormonism or not. I think that it is a small minority of people that get successful enough that they're actually able to support themselves full time doing what they do. But of course, when that happens, they're likely to put out a lot more videos than the rest of us because they have the time now. They don't have to be working some other day job. And that, I think, is partially what happened to John DeLynn. I think he got to the point where he was able to support himself doing Ex-Mormon or Mormon adjacent videos. And so he started producing a lot more Ex-Mormon content and hiring more people to help him produce Ex-Mormon content. And that's what he does for a living. If he couldn't make a living doing this, he would probably do a little bit less of it. He'd probably be working some other day job. He has the skill to do multiple other types of day jobs. And that's what he'd be doing with his life. But I think that at this point, he's doing what he does because he believes he has something of value to say, and he believes the people he interviews have something of value to say. I don't think it's primarily about money, even for someone who makes what I would consider a lot of money, like John DeLynn.
So how do Mormon stories help someone through a faith crisis? Well, if you go to their website, you will see this on their homepage banner. So what happens if I click here for support? Well, I'm brought to this page that has me view more videos. Why? Why would they have me view more videos? Because YouTube pays them for every view. Mormon Stories has about 65 million views. Based on the online source Credit Karma, the average rate for a view is about 0.018 cents per view. Now, it doesn't seem like a lot, but that means Mormon Stories has made roughly $1.1 million off of YouTube views. So it makes complete sense to send everyone they can back to watch more videos. It helps solidify a faith crisis in the member, and it's significant revenue for them. It's also why many of their video titles are over-sensationalized.
So I found that whole discussion really interesting because in comparison to other things that they could suggest, in order to make more money from people faster, what they're suggesting, first off, that this person sees is videos, which is a very slow way to make money in comparison to some other things that they could promote. So that's interesting to me. I don't think it's a really money-grabbing thing in my mind to suggest more of your own videos that much when they're YouTube videos and are available for free. Also, I don't think the titles of those videos are over-sensationalized. That's just not the I don't know what to call it. The impression. That's not the impression I get after having watched some of these videos and looked at their titles. I haven't watched all the Mormon Stories videos. Maybe some of them are over-sensationalized, but it seems pretty straightforward to me. They say something that actually happened to the person that they're interviewing. They put that in the title. Then they talk to the person about it. Maybe they pick a slightly more interesting thing that they necessarily need to put in the title, but pretty much every YouTuber is looking for the most interesting title that they can use. So no, I don't think that John DeLynn has a serious problem with over-sensationalizing his YouTube titles. I don't think that's what's going on here.
So the next thing they offer on their website are workshops and conferences. I clicked on the very first workshop on their events page and was brought to this page, and that is an online workshop for those struggling in their marriage. Well, I guess at least they acknowledge that a faith crisis can result in marriage difficulty, but notice the prices for these online courses. Now, I don't personally know how much money they make on these courses, but the prices seem pretty steep for an online course.
So that course, Marriage on a Tightrope, I think I know a little bit about, and I think it's done by someone else and then offered through Mormon Stories or something like that, because Marriage on a Tightrope, I think, is the name of a podcast that a couple does, one of the members of that couple being LDS, the other being former LDS, and they talk about how to deal with a mixed faith marriage. So I don't think that that is something that's directly just Mormon Stories doing it all by themselves. I don't know why it's expensive as it is, but that's the kind of thing that this course, I believe, is about. And as for a faith crisis causing problems in a marriage, I think there are two ways that can happen. The first way is that the now non-believing spouse says that they don't believe, and then the believing spouse, feeling that they have lost their eternal marriage, becomes very upset and considers divorce potentially because they feel like they're not going to get an eternal marriage through that person. They need to find somebody who will give them an eternal marriage. And so the stress of a relationship like that comes from people feeling that they have lost their eternal marriage and believing that they still need one. So it's not just the faith crisis alone that's causing it. It's the fact that the other person still believes that they need an eternal marriage in order to reach the highest level of the celestial kingdom. And the other possibility, of course, is that the non-believing spouse now sees morality in different ways and has a harder time dealing with things that the believing spouse does that both of them used to think were normal. For example, judging people who have certain behaviors or certain desires and so forth. That might really bother a non-believing spouse who now feels like the believing spouse is super judgmental, and how do they reconcile that in their life? Can they still raise kids with a person who doesn't approve of certain things that in society are now considered normal? And those are hard questions to ask. But I think that a lot of this has to do with newfound morality or beliefs that are still held on to from the church. It's not just about the faith crisis itself. And I wanted to point that out.
Now, another service they offer on their website is one-on-one coaching. The fees are, as you can see here, 25 minutes for it's $125 for a 25-minute session. For a 6-session package, it's $1,300. So again, they're coming to the rescue to help people after publishing thousands of negative videos that facilitated the faith crisis in the first place.
Okay, so I am not the person to judge whether those prices are reasonable or not. Maybe they're not. But there is one thing I want to point out, which is that John Dehlin, the founder of Mormon Stories, does have a PhD in psychology. I believe he is qualified to meet with people as a psychologist. And so if you consider that, assuming that he would be the one talking to people, I don't know how unreasonable that is when, without insurance, meeting with a psychologist is quite expensive. And that's all I'm going to say about that.
And last but not least, Mormon Stories links to books and other websites that are known anti-Mormon to help ensure a faith crisis in the member. These include Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History, cult, mind control books, and even anti-Christian books like Jesus Interrupted, revealing the hidden contradictions in the Bible. It is unconscionable that these kinds of books are employed to, quote, promote healing for a member with questions, which is what they claim.
Okay, two things to point out at this point. The first is, I don't think most of these books are actually produced by Mormon Stories, which means I don't think Mormon Stories is actually getting a cent from any of these books being bought by somebody else from someone else. They're just recommending these books because they actually think these books are good for people. And that is what's really frustrating about all this, is that you may believe that these books are terrible. You may believe that what's said in these books is wrong. But, like I said, Mormon Stories doesn't benefit from this. The reason they're offering these books isn't because they think they'll make money from these books. It's because they think that these books have something of value to say. They think these books can actually help someone who has had a faith crisis to be able to live a positive life afterward, and to be able to understand why they went through a faith crisis and what that means from a different perspective than the LDS Church wants them to. So that brings me back to thing number 2, which is that what really matters is something that is barely addressed at all in this video, which is who is telling the truth. Is the LDS Church actually telling the truth about its origins and about its truth claims? That is the most important thing to know in all of this.
Now, there is another newer nonprofit organization similar to Mormon Stories called Mormon Discussions, Inc. They have only been a nonprofit for a few years, but their numbers are similar to Mormon Stories when it when it was first starting out, and they currently have over 1,400 videos on YouTube. Now, the difference is Mormon Stories added another revenue stream of selling Ex-Mormon products both on their website and on their YouTube channel. They are growing rapidly and, in fact, more than doubled their contributions from 2020 to 2021. According to their website, their CEO's salary is $100,000 per year effective January 1st, 2023. Now, there are still other critics on YouTube that are not yet designated as nonprofit organizations, but nonetheless produce large numbers of videos, and therefore we can assume YouTube revenue. They include Exmo-Lex, Zelf on the Shelf, Cults to Consciousness, Nuance Ho, and others. In each case, in addition to being paid for videos, they solicit donations aggressively and or sell ex-Mormon products, and in this case, some of which are extremely offensive. They're mocking our temple ceremony and are just very bad. While some of them may have other reasons for being critics, in every case, money is certainly a contributing factor.
Okay, so a couple of things that I want to say about that. The first is, at this point in the video, the narrator actually does acknowledge that it's possible that ex-Mormon critics potentially have other motivations besides making money. And I think that's a good thing that that person acknowledges that. I think that what you have to look at is the sincerity factor. Does the fact that someone is making money from what they're doing automatically mean that they're insincere? And I would say no, because if that were the case, you'd have to write off all public school teachers, you'd have to write off all paid tutors, you'd have to write off everything that any paid doctor was saying as something you shouldn't listen to, because how could they be sincere? They're making money. I think that if you look at the ways some of these people got started, they got started trying to say what they wanted to say, and then it grew into a money-making thing for some of these people. And for example, Exmo-Lex, which is the YouTube channel that he actually shows, if you watch Exmo-Lex's first video, I believe it's called Why I Left the LDS or Mormon Church, whichever term she uses, and why I'm talking about it. And she talks about why she's making the video. And if you watch that, there's no indication that she is even thinking about making any money in any way at that point. She's just expressing her frustration at being told, keep your mouth shut about it, in regards to her leaving the Mormon Church. That's made her very upset, and so due to reverse psychology, she is doing exactly what she was told not to do and just speaking out and saying, I want to be able to say what I think. This is really bothering me. And that's how she got started on YouTube. Every content creator story is different, but I think they follow a pattern of people being willing to put stuff out there, even if they know they might never make any money from it at all. And so, yes, I do think that other motivations besides money are huge in this. Whether there's someone like me who has never made any money, or whether you're someone like John DeLynn who has made a lot of money, I think other motivations are very huge. And what are those motivations? It's not to deceive people, because after all, if anyone's been deceived, then so have we. Maybe we have all been deceived. But that means we're not trying to deceive anyone. We're just trying to share with them what we think is true information. and good information and helpful information. That's why we're doing what we're doing, primarily. And that's why I think it's so important to set this record straight and say, look, the problem is not the money. The problem is who is telling the truth. Can the LDS Church be trusted or not? That is the predominant question in all of this. And the other thing I have to talk about, of course, is products referencing the temple ceremony and why I believe people make these products. I've never made products like that, and I've never done anything to mock or make fun of the temple ceremony online. I've talked about how I felt about it, but I haven't made it funny. And nevertheless, I think I know why people do it, because I have listened to Ex-Mormon talk about it somewhat. And what it comes down to is that the temple ceremony is presented as being a wonderful, beautiful, sacred, secret thing. Actually, they actively discourage using the word secret, but everybody knows you're not supposed to talk about it. And it's supposed to be so wonderful, and yet so many people go in and feel things and experience things that they've never expected to feel in the temple. It's a difficult and surprising and sometimes shocking and frustrating experience for a lot of people, or at least it has been over the years. They've been changing the temple ceremony more and more so that hopefully it becomes less distressing to certain people. But there's so much history of people not feeling what they expected in the temple, not experiencing what they expected in the temple, and that's very difficult for people. I know the temple experience was difficult for me. And so what happens then is that these people, having been through that experience, having been told what it meant and being told essentially, this is a good experience. You have to accept it as being a good experience. You have to accept it as being from God. You don't get to decide what it means for you. We get to, or God gets to. You have these people being told that, or feeling like they've been told that, and then feeling or discovering certain information that makes them believe that it was all based on a lie anyway. But still having all these very difficult feelings associated with this temple ceremony. So to make themselves feel better about it, to hopefully move past those frustrated, betrayed feelings that they have, they turn it into something funny. And it's their way of saying, no, you don't get to decide what this experience means to me. I do. And I've decided that I think this is kind of funny. And that's something that even Mormons are going to have to learn to deal with eventually, because guess what? Even under Mormon doctrine, people do have freedom of choice. They have freedom to be able to decide what they do and do not think about certain things. And so these people, although LDS people may not like it, think it's incredibly offensive to things they hold deeply, deeply sacred, these people are just saying, this is how I see it. And that is something that they get to choose to do. And I know how LDS people view it, because I was an LDS person who saw people make fun of the temple ceremony. And it did upset me at the time. But it is something that's going to happen. And it's something that I think happens for a reason, which is that the temple ceremony is not the same for everyone, and some people do have a very difficult time with it. And that's all I'm going to say about that.
So to summarize, it would be considered unethical for a doctor to intentionally infect a patient with a disease in order to provide treatment and collect a fee. Yet LDS critics expose members to literally thousands of videos containing misinformation or assumptions about the LDS Church and its history, only to come to the rescue by offering activities that further increase their own revenue. As I said at the beginning, while critics are also individuals and children of God, we have to acknowledge that they are creating thousands of negative videos replete with half-truths and bad assumptions to cause or perpetuate a faith crisis, then exploiting the members they impact by making money off of the resulting emotional trauma. It is the absolute definition of unethical behavior.
And this is where I say, why do I have to acknowledge that these videos are filled with bad assumptions and misinformation? There is nowhere that you have demonstrated that in this entire video. I don't have to acknowledge that if you haven't shown me where these people are wrong or where I'm wrong. And I refuse to acknowledge that. I think that there may, from time to time, be something said about the church that is negative and inaccurate. But for the most part, most of these people are saying true information. You might not like the conclusions they come to from that true information, but most of the information they have is accurate. And the analogy of a doctor spreading a disease in order to sell the cure only works if the information is inaccurate. Because once it's accurate, you shouldn't compare true information to a disease. True information is not a disease. It can still cause problems, but ultimately, true information has more potential to be helpful than false information. And if the LDS Church is spreading false information and the true information is out there, people deserve to know that.
In the words of Neil A. Maxwell, studying the church through the eyes of its defectors is like interviewing Judas to understand Jesus.
That's one way to look at this. But another way to look at this is that studying the church through the eyes of defectors is like interviewing Jesus to understand the Pharisees, to use another biblical metaphor, or simile, I guess. It depends on who is telling the truth, or who is telling a more accurate version of the story. According to the Bible, Jesus had a more accurate view of reality than the Pharisees did, and a more accurate view of what God wanted. So he was the better person to listen to. Judas would have been a bad person to listen to because he had a less accurate view of reality. However, you have to look at what the evidence says in order to determine what is more accurate. You can't just assume you know who is telling the more accurate version. And that's why this analogy only works if people have already bought into the idea that church equals truth, Jesus equals truth, therefore all detractors bad.
So the choice is ours. We can spend months or years researching the hundreds of accusations of our critics to sort out fact from fiction, or we can understand what the critics are really trying to do and why, then simply dismiss their accusations out of hand.
And this is the part of the video that I find the most frustrating and problematic, because as I've shown in my analysis of this, there's no way of telling just from how much money a person is making whether or not they're actually telling the truth. And if there were a way of telling, the LDS Church doesn't stack up very well using this method of trying to figure out who's telling the truth, because it makes way more money than its detractors do at this point. And so no, based on logic, there's no way that you should just be dismissing everything I say and everything all the other critics of the LDS Church say out of hand, just based on the fact that some of us are making money. That's ridiculous.
So this brings us back to where it has always been. The most solid foundation we can gain about the gospel of Jesus Christ doesn't come from critics or apologists. It comes from God himself through the Holy Ghost. He is, after all, the source of all truth.
So now we get to something that is actually substantial, which is a claim that you can know the truth for yourself through the Holy Ghost. Finally, this person is addressing the real issue here, which is not how much money any of us make, whether it's the church or people critical of it. The real question is the truth of the church. And there is the claim that the Holy Ghost is the best way to know. That's the claim that I would like to dispute. I don't think that seeking answers through prayer is the best way to know the truth of anything. And in order to challenge that, I would just like to say, when is the last time that somebody through prayer has been able to know something that is falsifiable? Because I haven't seen it happen. I've seen people feel that they should do certain things after praying. And some of those things make sense, and some of those things don't make sense. And sometimes people do something that they feel that they should do, like marry a person, and then later on they divorce that person. What does that say about feelings that come after prayer? Can they really be trusted? I have a really hard time believing that they can, especially for someone like me, but that gets into a whole nother level of why I don't believe in the LDS Church truth claims anymore. However, I think that a much better way to determine whether something is true or not is to look for multiple sources of evidence, if possible, that point to the same conclusion. It's to make predictions about what you might find out about other things if a thing were true and see if those add up. It's to, if possible, listen to both sides of the story and see which side makes more sense. And it's to accept that in very few situations do we actually know the full story. Do we actually see the whole picture? Most of the time, most people are at least partially guessing what certain experiences mean and why. And I don't think that there is a sure way to get all knowledge from God or anyone else. Now, I don't think that anybody who watches this video with a believing mindset is necessarily going to change their mind about that point because of what I said, because feelings that come as a result of prayer are incredibly strong things. And because of that, I'm not really expecting this to change anybody's mind on that point. But I do hope that if someone watches this from a believing perspective, they at least realize that the real point of contention here is not who makes the most money. It's who is telling the truth. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please check out some of my other videos. Like, comment, consider subscribing. And hopefully I'll see you all soon. I do want to make more videos. I'm thinking of doing a series of videos for people who don't know as much about the LDS Church yet. Oh, that was the fireworks going off. I'm filming on the 4th of July. Anyway, if that's something you're interested in, please let me know. And I will see you all next time at some point. Bye.